Welcome, students. Um, so we are back to taking online classes again. Nonetheless, I will begin right away. I will continue from the portion that we had left off, the last class that we have had. That is in this page you can see over here. Sorry. Yes, you can see over here that we had, just a moment. We had read till here, this paragraph we had read till here, and we will begin with the next paragraph, that is. So you can see it's written that this dialectic is nowhere more apparent than in the art of writing. So whatever he has said up till now, he applies it to writing now and says that this is most applicable to the art of writing. Why? Because the literary object is a peculiar top which exists only in movement. So Sartre is trying to apply the Marxist significance of drama to all forms of writing, because if you remember in class I had told you about about drama, that it will take place only when it is acted, and that was something that was opined by the Marxist critic Raymond Williams. So he's trying to apply the same idea to the art of writing, to literary object, that is. It's like a top that will exist only in movement. And how does it come into force? To make it come into view, a concrete act called reading is necessary. Just like the audience or just like the viewers of a drama that brings the drama to existence, the reader is also very much an essential part in bringing the literary object into view, into the viewing site, into perspective, that is. And it lasts only as long as this act can last. Beyond that, there are only black marks on paper. That is true. If a book is not read, there are just black marks on paper. Now the writer cannot read what he writes, whereas the shoemaker can put on the shoes he has just made if they are his size, and the architect can live in the house he has built. So why cannot a writer read what he writes? He will say that in reading one foresees, one waits, that is the anticipation involved within the act of reading, which we should all be familiar to. One foresees the end of a sentence, the following sentence, the next page. One waits for them to confirm or disappoint one's foresights. That may happen, both can happen, that is, either can happen. The reading is composed of a host of hypotheses, of presumptions and assumptions, of dreams followed by awakenings, the assumptions which are broken, of hopes and deceptions. Readers are always ahead of the sentence. They are reading in a merely probable future which partly collapses and partly comes together in proportion as they progress. Which, he says, withdraws from one page to the next and forms the moving horizon of the literary object. Without waiting, without a future, without ignorance, there is no objectivity. So here is how we arrive at objectivity. How do we arrive at objectivity? He is saying that waiting causes that objectivity to appear. Foreseeing or anticipating a future causes that objectivity. Ignorance also produces objectivity. And how do we arrive at all of these stances, waiting, foreseeing the future. He has just said that in the previous page, that a reader will foresee the end of a sentence of the next page, and I as a reader will anticipate what is about to happen. My hopes, there will be I will hope for a certain ending. I will be deceived. Something else will happen, or my hope will be maintained. And the reader is always ahead of the sentence. And we are always apprehensive. As a reader, we are always living in the future, in a probable future. We are living in a probable future. We are reading in a probable future. What is going to happen in the very next paragraph, for example. And this probable future will partly collapse because all of our assumptions will not be met. This probable future will also partly come together. And there will be, and both this collapsing and coming together will be in proportion as we continue to read. As we continue to read, it's a cumulative process. And slowly we reach towards the end, only after which we can say that yes, I have read a book substantiating that piece of writing, thus creating that literary object. So it is as if a talk which exists in movement, the literary object, that is. And what are the forces that bring this literary object into movement? Reading, this is moving, reading and writing. This is what brings the literary object into movement. Now, it continues in the next paragraph, and I will skip a few lines. Just a moment, something just popped up. I'm sorry. So the underlying lines, that is the function of his gaze, his as in the author's gaze, and gazing towards what? The literary object. Sartre says that the writer can see what he has created, he or she has created, but he or she will not see the literary object in the same way the reader will see. The function of the author's gaze is not to reveal, he's saying, by brushing against them, the sleeping words which are waiting to be read, but to control the sketching of the signs. In short, it is a purely regulating mission, and the view before him reveals nothing except for slight slips of the pen. The writer neither foresees nor conjectures. He projects whatever the world has revealed to him or her. The writer projects whatever perception he has created about the world, and he tries to regulate that. He tries to channelize his ideas, the images of the world, into a certain fashion, which are meant or which are also waiting to be read. So the writer, he says, neither foresees nor guesses, unlike the reader, which he has just established in the previous paragraph that the reader does exactly that. The reader foresees, assumes, presumes, guesses, but the writer, on the other hand, projects. I will skip again. So I will just skip to the marked or highlighted lines, that is. Thus the writer meets everywhere only his knowledge, his will, his plans. If you remember in the previous class, when we were reading, Sartre has said in the previous paragraph, the previous page, that is over here itself, that it is we who have invented the laws by which we judge it. It is our history, our love, our gaiety, and we recognize it in it. Even if we should look at it without touching it any further, we never receive from it that gaiety or love. We put them into it. The result which we have obtained on canvas or paper never seemed to us objective. So this is the same strain of thought which is continuing over here, that the writer only meets with his knowledge everywhere he sees, his will, his plans. He sees himself. He touches only his own subjectivity, however he has perceived the world, however he has chosen to regulate his perception into words on a paper. Then he says, the object he creates is out of reach. He does not create it for himself. The artist's creation is not for the artist. If he rereads himself, it is already too late. The sentence will never quite be a thing in his eyes. He goes to the very limits of the subjective, but without crossing it. That is, the writer will never be able to read his or her own work from the perspective of others, because we can never do that, because the writer can never do that, because it is his writer, because it is the writer's will that he or she sees in his book or whatever he or she has written. It is the writer's choices, the writer's perception. That is why he never crosses the subjective realm. He appreciates the effect of a touch, of an epigram, of a well-placed adjective, but it is the effect they will have on others. That is more important. He can judge it, not feel it. Then he will go on to give an example. Proust never discovered the homosexuality of Charles, since he had decided upon it even before the starting on a book. So this is a character in Proust's within a budding grove. Within a budding grove, where Baron Palamide de Charlus is a fictional character, of course, and he is a licentious gay man who is found in the second part of this novel of Proust. So Sartre is saying that Proust never discovered, that is, the information or the knowledge that Charlus was homosexual did not come anew to Proust, because he already knew it even before he started writing the book. And if a day comes when the book takes on for its author a semblance of objectivity, he says that if even there is a semblance of objectivity, even if there is a slight probability, it is because years have passed, because he has forgotten it, because its spirit is quite foreign to him, and doubtless he is no longer capable of writing it. This was the case of T.S. Eliot when he was reading Hamlet and his problems again, and writing about what he felt when he read it again, and he wrote about it to criticize a critic. So he wrote about one of his essays in one of his other later essays. And Sartre gives another example. This was the case with Rousseau when he reread The Social Contract at the end of his life. Thus, it is not true that one writes for oneself. So why is it not true? He has just explained it to us. We'll skip a few lines. It is the joint effort of author and reader which brings upon the scene that concrete and imaginary object which is the formal work of the mind. There is no art except for and by others. It's a very important line and a very true one. So he says that একটু আগেই বলছিল, the literary object is like a top in movement, brought into force or brought into view only with the act of reading objectively and writing subjectively, which we just established. So therefore it is obviously a joint effort of the author and reader which brings upon the scene, that is, brings to view that concrete act of reading and imaginary the imaginary creation of the writer, which is the work of the mind, the writer's work of the mind. So therefore there is no art except for and by others. What is literature? This book, this literary object in front of me, is written by an other, not myself. Sartre had written this book, What is Literature, for me, not for himself. Therefore, no art in this entire world exists which is not for others and also not by others. Reading seems, in fact, to be the synthesis of perception and creation. Next, he says that reading seems, in fact, to be the synthesis of perception and creation. It is true. Again, he's repeating what he has just said. He says that both the subject and the object are important for the act of reading to be successful. Perception is necessary because it is through the act of perception that the object exists. The object needs to exist, and because of that, perception is necessary. And this is done. It is brought into perception. It is done by the subject. The subject is essential because the subject discloses the object. It is because of the act of reading that the book exists. And the object is also essential because it imposes its own structures. We have to wait for it to disclose itself, like reading a book. And that is why he says that the reader is conscious of disclosing in creating, of creating by disclosing. Disclosing the meaning of the book that has been created by the writer. And creating the reader, that is the reader's own perception about the book, own ideas and images about the book in relation to his or her own reality, as a pragmatist, very much like Sartre himself is, creating his or her own perception by disclosing the work of art. The reader does both. If he is at his best, he will project beyond the words a synthetic form. If he is at his best, Sartre says that if the reader is at his best, You will project beyond the words a synthetic form. That is, post reading or with reading, he will look beyond the words to form a synthetic signification, a synthetic meaning of the work of art, each phrase of which will be no more than a partial function, the theme, the subject, or the meaning. So the words themselves will not provide meaning to the reader. The reader has to arrive at the meaning by his or her own effort. That is when the reader is at his best. Sartre is saying that when we as readers look beyond the words, which serve only partial functions, which only serve the partial functions of being the theme, quote unquote theme, the subject, the meaning. Beyond all of this, the reader, when the reader is at the best, he will form a synthetic form, a synthetic signification. The synthesis of the writer's effort and his or her own creation of an image after reading. Since it is he, the reader, on the contrary, who allows the significance of each of them to be understood. That is also true. The subject, the meaning, the theme, all of these are insignificant without the act of reading, without the reader being attentive while he or she is reading. And the literary object, though realized through language, is never given in language. That is, the true meaning, the significance, the importance of a book, of the literary object, does not merely exist in the words or phrases or sentences that fill the pages of a book. It is the act of reading. It is the act of the attentive reader, the conscious choice of the attentive reader, that the larger significance, the larger implications of the book are brought into the forefront. So therefore, even though the meaning is arrived through language, because we are reading the words on a paper, the significance of the book does not lie within that language itself, or all of it does not lie over there. And if that is the case, if language is not causing us to arrive at a meaning, then there is some silence involved over here. Silence, on the contrary, it is by nature a silence and an opponent of the word. We will discuss about it later on in a bit details. What is this silence, that is? If, he says later on, he does not invent it and does not then place there and hold on to the words and sentences which he awakens. So the silence, very simply put, is the endeavor of the reader to look beyond the words. You can sit down with a book, read each and every word one by one, up by one, page after page after page, and never arrive at a significance, never arrive at the reader's subjective importance or subjective meaning of the book. And on the other hand, if you look beyond those words, if you are at your best attentive, when you want to arrive at a larger implication of the literary object which is in front of you, when you want to do that, when you choose to do that, when you know that there is a signification beyond the words, when you reside by silence, when you believe in that silence, in the absence of language, there is silence, right? So when you believe in that silence, you will accomplish the meaning of the literary object. And when you are doing that, when you are looking beyond the words which have been chosen and put on the pages by the writer, you are also reinventing the literary object. You are discovering the literary object. Unlike Proust, the writer, who does not need to discover because he already knows before even he has started to write. So when you as a reader are doing that, you are reinventing the literary object. That is why he says a reinvention which would be as new and as original as the act of the first invention. It is the absence of words, the undifferentiated and lived silence of inspiration which the word will then particularize, whereas the silence produced by the reader is an object. So, in the absence of language, there is silence. And in that absence, the reader is reinventing, rediscovering the literary object, creating new significations, creating new meaning, therefore recreating an object. It is the very literary object that is being recreated over here. And at the very interior of this object, there are more silences, which the author does not mention. It is a question of silences which are so particular that they could not retain any meaning outside the object which the reader causes to appear. However, it is these which give it its destiny and its particular face. And in this recreated literary object which the reader has brought into existence, there are even more meanings which the writer does not mention. Of course, he cannot mention it because it is the reader who has arrived at this meaning completely out of his own volition, out of his own endeavor, out of his own attention to the literary object that he or she is reading. So there are more silences which the author does not mention because they are a complete discovery, a new discovery of the reader. And these silences, they are so particular to the reader, that is because it is the reader who has caused them to appear. However, he says that is these which give it its destiny and particular face. Of course, the reader makes the destiny of the literary object. A book written 100 years ago, how it has been read by other people, told to by even more others by those very readers. That is how a book becomes immortal. That is how the book arrives at its destiny. That is the destiny of the book. And since it is the reader's act of reading, conscious act of reading, conscious choice of reading, which forms the destiny of the literary object, he will go on to say in the next page that the literary object has no other substance than the reader's subjectivity. Reader gives the book its destiny. The book will have no other substance. It will have no other essential existence in this world other than the significance, the importance that the reader has attached to it. That is why the substance of the literary object is nothing else than the reader's own subjective interpretation of that book, the reader's own subjectivity. So he goes on to give the example of Raskolnikov of Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov's waiting is my waiting. His hatred is my hatred. I am animating him. I am realizing Raskolnikov's hatred and Raskolnikov's waiting and characterizing it to Raskolnikov. It's my doing, the reader's doing. The words are there like traps to arouse our feelings and to reflect them towards us. Each word is a path of transcendence. It shapes our feelings, names them, attributes them to an imaginary personage who takes it upon himself to live them for us and who has no other substance than these borrowed passions. He confers objects, perspectives, and a horizon upon them. So words are like traps, he says. Words will impose certain feelings upon us. And the very next step, we will find characters within a book or people within a book who will live those feelings within the story, within the narrative, within whatever is presented in that literary object. Thus, for the reader, all is to do and all is already done. It is a dilemma, it is a predicament. The work exists only at the exact level of his capacities, the reader's capacity. That is what, that is the center around which the implications, the significances, the interpretations of the book lies around the reader. Since the creation can find its fulfillment only in reading, which we have already established, since the artist must entrust to another the job of carrying out what he has begun, since it is only through the consciousness of the reader that he can regard himself as essential to the work, all literary work is an appeal. It is a request from the writer to the reader. Why? Because the reader is important, very important. Why? We just established why. Up until here, Sartre was answering this question. That is why the literary work is an appeal. To write is to make an appeal to the reader, that he lead into objective existence the revelation which I have undertaken by means of language. Very true. And if it should be asked to what the writer is appealing, the answer is simple. As the sufficient reason for the appearance of the aesthetic object is never found either in a book or in the author's mind, and as his subjectivity, which he cannot get away from, cannot give a reason for the act of leading into objectivity, the appearance of the work of art is a new event which cannot be explained by anterior data. And since this directed creation is an absolute beginning, it is therefore brought about by the freedom of the reader and by what is purest in that freedom. Thus the writer appeals to the reader's freedom to collaborate in the production of his work. So what does the writer appeal to then? He appeals to the freedom of the reader. The reader should voluntarily, willfully choose to read the book, choose to pay attention to the words, but look beyond the mere meanings of each and every word, each and every phrase which partially form the meaning of the book. Look beyond all of these words in order to form a synthesis, in order to form a synthetic form, which is a discovery completely made by the reader, therefore recreating the work of art, continuing the destiny of the work of art. And this freedom is what the writer appeals to collaborate in his work of art, in his creation. It is true that the tool is the congealed outline of an operation, but it remains on the level of the hypothetical imperative. I may use a hammer to nail up a case or to hit my neighbor over the head. Insofar as I consider it in itself, it is not an appeal to my freedom. It does not put me face to face with it. Rather, it aims at using it by substituting a succession of traditional procedures for the free invention of means. The book does not serve my freedom. It requires it. So over here then, Sartre says next that the book, the work of art, is a tool. But every tool is defined by its usage. So hammer, the word hammer itself, the tool itself, is defined by its name. The name is also the work it does. Hammer is both a verb and a noun. So I may pick up a hammer to hit a nail on the wall or hit on my neighbor's head. That is the example Sartre gives. So that means that I cannot look at the tool for the usage that lies in itself, within the tool itself. So he says that I should substitute the set of traditional procedures, a hammer used to hammer. I should substitute all of these traditional procedures and I should freely invent other means of using it, other ways of using it. I should put it to my own subjective use, like the bricolaire of Derrida's Science, Structure and Play. Thus, he says, the book is not, like the tool, a means for any end whatever. The end to which it offers itself is the reader's freedom. And the Kantian expression, finality without an end, seems to me quite inappropriate for designating the work of art. In fact, it implies that the aesthetic object presents only the appearance of a finality and is limited to soliciting the free and ordered play of the imagination. So, according to Kant, or the way Kant propagates the appreciation of a work of art, Kant says that the work of art has a finality without an end, which means, Sartre says, according to Sartre, Kant means that the aesthetic object only has an appearance of finality. And the aesthetic object can only contain a regulated movement of imagination, regulated by the author. So the reader's role is not important over here. So Sartre continues that it forgets that this theory, Kantian notion of the work of art being a finality, having a finality without an end, Sartre says it forgets that the imagination of the spectator, that is the reader's imagination is also important. And this imagination of the reader has not only a regulating function, but a constitutive one. That this imagination is signification in itself. It does not only work to give an order to the work of art, to the literary object, but this imagination itself is a new production produced entirely by the reader, the meaning that I have arrived at. I have not only tried to arrive at the meaning what the writer has implied, but also my own interpretation, my own layer upon the work of art. It does not play. It is called upon to recompose the beautiful object beyond the traces left by the artist. All of those silences which the author has not mentioned, something we just read. So the traces beyond the traces left by the artist. The reader's imagination does that. The imagination cannot reveal in itself any more than can the other functions of the mind. There would be finality without end if some object offered such a well-arranged composition that it would lead us to suppose that it has an end, even though we cannot ascribe one to it. That is, an ideal work of art will be an ideal work of art according to this Kantian logic would be a closed object where everything, all forms of meaning, all sorts of meaning, all kinds of perspectives would be included, but that is not possible. By defining the beautiful in this way, one can, and this is what Kant wants, that is, this is Kant's aim, liken the beauty of art to natural beauty, like the flower, which is in so much symmetry, which is in such a perfect state of existence, such harmonious colors, such natural odors, which bring upon the image of the flower to our mind. The image of the flower in our mind is concrete reality. We cannot add on to that reality. We cannot perceive that reality subjectively. The beauty of a flower is universal, almost. Well, if I am to adhere to what Sartre wants to say over here. And this is what Kant wants to do. He wants to equate the appreciation of natural beauty with the appreciation of a work of art. That is what he wants to do. But that is not, the two are not similar, Sartre says. The beauty of nature is in no way comparable to that of art. The work of art does not have an end. It does not. We know that. We are studying 500 years old of produced literature, even more, even older, that is. The work of art does not have an end. But the reason is that it is an end. Kantian formula does not account for the appeal which resounds at the basis of each painting, each statue, each book. Kant believes that the work of art exists as fact and that it is then seen. That is, it exists as an a priori. It has an a priori existence, the work of art, that it exists before the reader perceives it, or before the viewer perceives it. Therefore, idealizing its existence, making it perfect, making it immovable, uninterpretable, non-penetrable, non-porous, that is. Whereas Sartre says, on the other hand, it exists only if one looks at it, like drama, like a work of art, like the literary object brought into the view, brought onto the scene, only with the conscious choice of reading, the endeavor of the reader to look beyond the words, to enjoy the work of art in silence, without paying attention to the intention of the artist, to the imposed meanings of the writer himself. It exists only if one looks at it, and if it is first pure appeal, pure exigence to exist, urgency to exist. It wants to exist, the work of art. It is an urgent appeal. It presents itself as a task to be discharged. From the very beginning, it places itself as on the level of the categorical imperative. You are perfectly free to leave that book on the table. Categorical imperative. He's defining it. This is an example of it. But if you open it, you assume responsibility for it. This imperative, which is transcendent, yet acquiesced means accepted, which freedom itself adopts as its own, is what we call a value. The work of art is a value because it is an appeal. The imperative, the urgent necessity for the work of art to be accounted for, if you are picking it up, if the reader picks it up. It does not matter. But if the reader has picked it up, the work of art will send out an urgent appeal to the reader to make it exist. And that is how the work of art acquires value. Because that appeal exists. So he says, if I appeal to my reader so that we may carry the enterprise which I have begun to a successful conclusion, it is self-evident that I consider him as pure freedom, as an unconditioned activity. True, that is what a writer must set out for. Thus, in no case can I address myself to his passiveness, because I am asking the reader to continue to collaborate in my work of art, to give it its destiny, to realize its destiny. So therefore, I cannot appeal to the passivity of the reader. That is, I cannot try to affect him, to communicate to him from the very first emotions of fear, desire, or anger. These have to be arrived at by the reader's own volition, if they exist at all. Even if they do not exist, the reader may arrive at such a conclusion out of his or her own volition, exercising his freedom of choice. Freedom is alienated in the state of passion. Writers should not seek to overwhelm, otherwise he is in contradiction with himself. If he wishes to make demands, he must propose only the task to be fulfilled. Hence the character of pure presentation, which appears essential to the work of art. The reader must be able to make a certain aesthetic withdrawal. So the writer cannot tell the reader what to do with this work of art. That decision has to be arrived at by the reader himself or herself. Freedom is alienated in the state of passion. We cannot overwhelm our readers. We cannot dish out propaganda. That is what overwhelms viewers, audiences, and readers. That is what has been happening in the recent present. We must not do that. The writers must not do that. No artist should do that. That is what Sartre is asking for. And even though if the book is comic, we laugh. If it is sad, we cry. These feelings are of a particular kind, he says. They have their origin in freedom. They are loaned. The belief which I accord the tale is freely assented to. It is a passion in the Christian sense of the word, a kind of love which Christ contained within himself for everybody on this planet, for everybody on this earth. It is that kind of passion, that is freedom, which resolutely puts itself into a state of passiveness to obtain a certain transcendent effect by this sacrifice. So the reader, when he or she has established that aesthetic withdrawal from the work of art, withdrawing from any sort of demands made by the writer. So when you watch a propaganda film, a propaganda book, when you read a propaganda book, the writer or the director appeals to you to do a certain thing in a certain fashion, this or that. As a conscious viewer or a reader, you must be able to create a wall between the propagandist demands, and your own interpretation of the work of art. That is the aesthetic withdrawal. That aesthetic withdrawal, that sort of a passiveness is accorded for, is wanted. That is what Sartre is saying. And if you do not maintain that much of passivity, that essential passivity, that important passivity, that aesthetic withdrawal, then the reader becomes credulous or gullible or prone to excessive belief. And And the reader is fooled into believing that he or she is being free. A similar thing can happen to the author as well, to the writer as well. When somebody tells the writer, either one believes in your story, it is intolerable, or one does not believe in it, and it is ridiculous. Sartre says the argument is absurd because the characteristic of aesthetic consciousness is to be a belief by means of commitment. By oath, a belief sustained by fidelity to oneself and to the author, a perpetually renewed choice to believe. So the belief which is constructed post-reading, post-watching, post bringing the work of art into existence by the conscious choice of reading. The belief that is caused then is by means of commitment. Commitment not only to find out what the author is trying to say or impose upon you, but a commitment also to yourself, as the reader also to yourself. Commitment both to the self, to oneself, and to the author. So if you are committed to your own beliefs, if your character is strong, that is the kind of reader that Sartre is asking for. When you are at your best, you are not gullible. You are not fooled into believing a dished out choice. You will see that, yes, but you will also remain committed to your own self, to your own subjective self, to your own consciousness. All feelings which are exacted on the basis of this imaginary belief are like particular moderations of my freedom. Every time my book is read, Sartre is saying, as a writer, my freedom is being modulated according to the need of the reader. Thus, the reader's feelings are never dominated by the object. And as no external reality can condition them, they have their permanent source in freedom. That is, they are all generous. For I call a feeling generous which has its origin and its end in freedom. Thus, reading is an act of generosity. And what the writer requires of the reader is not the application of an abstract freedom, but the gift of his whole person with his passions, his prepossessions, his sympathies, his sexual temperament, and his scale of values. The reader must be generous to give all of these things to the writer via the act of reading. Not just reading the words on a book, not just arriving at the theme that the author has created for the book, looking beyond them, forming a synthetic form, creating a synthetic form beyond the words on the pages, looking beyond the propaganda that might be presented by the writer. Being committed as a reader, being generous, by thinking, being generous by the fullest use of consciousness. And for Sartre, consciousness is created, it comes to existence relationally, in relation to the world outside. So when you are aware of that as a reader, and then you carry out the act of reading, you will be generous. That is generosity. When you are exercising your freedom, when you are using your own sexual temperament, your own culture, your own tradition, your own subjective philosophy in order to unearth the meaning of the book, reinterpret the book, give it its destiny, create it anew, then you are being generous. That is why we see people who are known for their toughness and shed tears at the recital of imaginary misfortunes. For the moment, they have become what they would have been if they had not spent their lives hiding their freedom from themselves. So that is why we see even the toughest of people crying when they hear an emotional recital, because they are exercising their freedom They are relating to the work of art according to their own subjective disposition. And this is because of their own subjective disposition. And to this I will add another link which will continue this lecture, that is, watch both of the videos, note down any queries or questions that you might have, and then come to me with all of the questions later on, whenever at your convenience, that is. Thank you very much.